Hey everyone, and welcome to my Procreate demo for the piece I call New Crops. So this was an older drawing that I did a couple years ago, I think it was, for one of the Inktober's, and I always wanted to color it, and for whatever reason, never really got to it. So this is me taking a stab at that. A lot of the time when you draw a lot and then you end up just doing one that for whatever reason you really dig, and this is sort of one of those for me. I always liked it, and when I went to color it, I sort of knew that I wanted to make it look a little bit old-fashioned, but I didn't really know what I wanted to do with that, and you'll actually see some of that confusion crop up in the middle of me coloring this. So there's no drawing portion, obviously, because I drew this with a ballpoint pen and pencil like a while ago. So now we're just going straight into flatting and a bit of a colorization on the lines, which I can discuss how to do that in another video. In fact, I think I have discussed it in the past, but I can do that at some point. So for this right now, I'm just going through and doing a lot of flats, trying to keep my palette on the yellow side because I wanted it to look old. And then you see like a lot of textures sort of turning on and off throughout the process. I knew that I wanted this thing to look weathered, but I actually really didn't know how I wanted it to look as far as weathered goes. So I wanted to try and give this guy some sort of a stereotypical palette of like what we might imagine a guy like this look like. I mean, he looks like he could be a hunter, he looks like he could be a farmer, he looks like he could be a number of things if we're just sort of going by visual stereotypes. So that's sort of what I wanted to lean into when I was choosing the flats for this. So here's the start of my confusion. You can see in the background I'm doing this painty thing that is reminiscent of something like J.C. Leyendecker, but not obviously as good because I'm trying to find a shortcut for it, and I'm also trying to do it in Procreate instead of using real paint, so there's like a dimensionality to it that doesn't necessarily come off. So what I attempt to do here, you'll see in a second, is after I put in all of these strokes using one of the brushes from Procreate, I think it was like the dry brush or the oriental brush or something like that, I then like duplicate it and blur it and use that blur underneath as like shadow, which is what all that was right there. And you can see there's like a decent amount of depth to it. The resolution isn't as good as when you're seeing it in Procreate. It actually came out much nicer than I expected. So here now I'm thinking to myself, well shit, can I just trick that on the actual painting itself? So you can actually do something like this in Procreate pretty easily by using like layer effects and doing a bevel and emboss and using transparency and a bunch of shit like that. But I was going to see if I could really quickly try to do it here. Now, if I were actually going to move forward with this technique, this wouldn't be the pass that I would use. This is just a test pass. This is just the experimental phase of if I throw a bunch of this paint down real quick and I put some layer effects on it, and well, not layer effects, but in Procreate I blur it and duplicate it and do a bunch of shit like that, can I actually get something that sort of fakes that painterly look across it without actually doing the painterly effort? Now you can see here, once I start flipping it into different layer settings, it doesn't really work. I try it a little bit, but it's just not working out. So we move on, and I move on to doing a couple of other things. I wanted to make him suntan. I tweaked the color of his lines a little bit. I'm doing a bunch of stuff there that's just like really tricky stuff, but it doesn't look good. So I abandoned that paint on the background and I decide that I'm going to go for more of a magazine look, and I do this distortion around the edges. Now that's something that a lot of you probably don't know some easy tricks for, so let's go into doing that. So now we're just going to color the canvas like a mid-tone gray yellow just so that we can have something to contrast the edges. Now you can actually physically go in and paint torn edges and bent edges and all of that stuff really, directly, like in the sense of just like I'm gonna replicate some reference I have. This is more just a really fast way to have some torn edges. So I use the watercolor brush because I feel that it's got sort of the right general shape in order to achieve what I'm going for. And so because it has like, watercolor brushes tend to have a distinct shape, and it's really good when you're going in and you're doing a lot of color and everything. Sometimes when you're doing this, you want these shapes to look really unique. So you can see I go in first and I start putting it down, but then I go in with, I shrink it and I sort of further distort its own pattern a little bit because you don't want it to be hyper recognizable. Now the nice thing is something like this is a very small element across an entire illustration, so people aren't going to be necessarily focusing on that, but People do look for things like repetitive digital brushes and things, just to see, like, oh, how did he do this? Like, did he just rely on the brush? Did he use some other creativity? Whatever. So I try to make it as look pretty natural. Now, again, this is a trick version of this, so it's easier. It's not just going in and actually painting all of this. So hopefully this is good for something like this entire piece, the new crops piece, because it's quick and you can sort of throw it on at the end, and it's not the feature of the piece, but it gives it a little bit of added, feel. So now what we're going to do is we're going to select, we're going to fill the whole canvas with like a darker color. There it is. Obviously, because this is recorded off the canvas, I did this in real time, and now I'm having to wait for myself to do it in the past. So now we select that section that we painted. This is all on different layers, you can see there. We select it, and then we delete away from that whole fill that we did. So assuming you've done this all around the piece, and you've done this on multiple corners, this would be cleared on all of those corners at the same time. So now we're going to Gaussian blur it, that big chunk, so that it bleeds a little bit into the section that we already painted. Now, is there actually a super perceivable drop shadow off of a tear like that in the real world? Maybe sometimes, probably not all the time, but it's a way to imply it when you're doing it digitally. So now we're going to select the inverse of the corner and delete from that. So now you can see we just have this blurred edge that goes around the inner part of the what would be the torn part of it. So now I switched it to multiply and I adjusted. This is that touchy-feely part where you're always trying to figure out, like, do I make this lighter? Do I make this darker? Another thing that you can do here that I demo here very briefly, but it actually isn't super successful here, but actually just yesterday at work I was doing something like this and it was more successful, which is now adding a slight lightened rim to the part of the paper that still exists, that hasn't been ripped off. So you just do the opposite. You use white, you fill where you painted before, and then you select, you blur it, and then you select that again, and you delete it. And that way the white is bleeding just onto the part that you want to keep. So then you can set it to either an add or a lighten or something like that. It really depends what you're going for, and you can adjust its levels to try and give it a little bit of that dimensionality. Now the problem I'm having here is, because I wasn't really thinking about this when I went into it, is I'm dealing with a lot of similar values and a lot of similar shades of this like sort of brown family of colors, so it doesn't show up super great. So you can see me here going in and adjusting, trying to darken the drop shadow, lighten the rim and all that stuff, and then I even go in and I erase away some of the blur just to try and contain it more and make it look a little bit more natural, as opposed to just this sort of like big digital blur, because sometimes that's just really obvious depending on the look and feel that you're going for. But you can see here, this is me going in just adjusting that, and when this is all done and I'm done adjusting all of the values and erasing, you'll see that it's a relatively see, there we go. So now I'm adjusting it further, and now see, you can see it's a relatively convincing paper tear. Now if you want to go the extra mile, I found that in Procreate there's a brush that's actually really good for simulating the texture of paper when it's that sort of rough, like when you've got a comic book and the top layer of the paper sort of tears a little bit. So if you go into your brushes and you scroll all the way to the right, there's the industrial section, and the wasteland brush is actually really nice for trying to simulate this. Now first here I screw up and I actually paint on my layer, which I obviously don't want to do if I'm painting black onto the white there. So now this is where I realize that when I adjust the opacity of it and I undo it all and just put it back onto the other layer that I had created previously, and I lay it down much quicker now because I'm annoyed that I did it in the first place. So you can see that, like, yeah, that totally looks like a wastelandy texture, but when it's got its opacity adjusted, or when it's switched to an overlay like I'll do here in a second, it's really subtle. But if you ever decide to print this out at a higher res or post it at a higher res, people will notice that, and they will hopefully appreciate the fact that you added a little bit of texture to it. So now, just for the sake of showing it in a more complete sense, even though I would not recommend completely duplicating the same torn corner across everything. Here's me just taking it and duplicating it across all 4 corners so that you can see the effect that it ultimately gives. And there we go. So that's sort of what the look is when you are trying to do that torn edges. You'll notice also, if you saw me posting on Instagram, I have some text in this, and there isn't a text tool in Procreate, of course. So I figured, well, the vibe I'm going for is sort of a 1950s Field and Stream sort of cover. So I found one of those covers and just basically traced letters, and then had to make up a couple of letters because they weren't in the words Field and Stream. So you can see that right here, and otherwise, you know, a lot of the retro vibe of the text is just trying to find the right color palette so that it feels like it's dated, and both from an aging perspective and from a style perspective. Then I decided to go further and put the date on it and the price on it. So I used that same not Farm Life, that's what I'm making up here, that same Field and Stream cover, and found this. Now, unfortunately, Procreate shit the bed on me, and I lost some of this at the very end where I did additional lettering, so you won't see the time lapse of that, but I mean, it's basically the same process, just repeated. So I do some adjusting. I actually made that G bigger on purpose because every now and then you would see some like anomalies in the type back then, and something like a G might be bigger. So that's why that one sort of goes over the top. I thought it'd be kind of cool. And then here we go. That's the finished piece right there. Doing all the text and everything was really fun. And doing the halftone and just trying to make the thing age in general was really fun. So I really hope you enjoyed watching. If you did, please like and subscribe. It always helps. And otherwise, I'll see you on the next one. And if you're looking for me on the internet, these are the places where you can find me.